I spent years managing my family's bills, only for them to kick me out and call me selfish, but I did this instead. Over time, I'd noticed countless moments where I felt pushed to the sidelines, holidays where Matt's side of the family was showered with attention while I sat quietly, birthdays where he got flashy gifts while I received practical things like socks or a coat. I convinced myself it didn't matter, parents are just like that sometimes, I thought. Besides, I'd always prided myself on being independent. I didn't need the spotlight or accolades. But everything shifted when Matt married Brenda and their first son, Tyler, was born. Suddenly, Matt wasn't just the favorite anymore, he was elevated to the golden child, the one who gave them grandkids. My parents acted as if their lives were finally complete now that they could proudly wear the grandparent's badge. While I was genuinely happy for him, I couldn't ignore how invisible I felt within my own family. Still, I shrugged it off. Family is supposed to support each other, right? Or so I'd always told myself. Then, at the end of last year, things spiraled. Matt lost his job as a manager at a small retail chain when the company started shutting down locations. His store was among the first to close. It sucked, I truly felt bad for him. Brenda called our parents in tears, worrying about how they'd survive on her part-time income from the bakery. Predictably, Matt wasn't exactly a savings-savvy guy, no surprise there, so losing his paycheck hit them hard. But instead of helping him come up with a plan to get back on his feet, my parents' brilliant solution was to invite him, Brenda, and their 2 kids to move in with them. On paper, it might seem reasonable. They had the space, and families pull together in tough times. The problem? That space they were so graciously offering was mine. It all went down on a Sunday night. I'd just gotten back from a grueling work trip, exhausted and desperate for nothing more than a hot shower and my own bed. But the moment I walked through the door, I knew something was off. My parents were seated at the kitchen table, Mom with her usual overly concerned expression, and Dad fiddling with his watch in silence. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk," Mom said, her voice laced with that faux sympathy she's mastered. I dropped my bag by the door and sat down, already bracing myself. She didn't waste any time. "You know how tough things have been for your brother since he lost his job. He has Brenda and the kids to worry about, and they really have nowhere else to go." My stomach sank. I knew exactly where this was going. "So, where are they going to stay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mom's face lit up as though she'd rehearsed this moment. "The basement suite. It's perfect for them. It's separate from the main house, so they'll have privacy. Brenda and the kids will be comfortable there." I blinked, trying to process. "Wait, my basement suite? Where am I supposed to go?" Dad finally spoke, his voice subdued but firm. "We've set up the hobby room for you. It's cozy. Plenty of space." The hobby room? That glorified storage closet crammed with Mom's sewing machine, random bins of holiday decorations, and half-finished crafts? It wasn't even close to being a bedroom. "You've got to be kidding," I said, hoping this was some cruel joke. Mom's tone shifted, her defensiveness rising like clockwork. "It's only temporary, Sarah. Besides, this is our house, and we need to make decisions that benefit the family as a whole. You'll be fine in the hobby room." And there it was, their house. That classic line meant to shut me up. The conversation ended with me sitting there in stunned silence, while they patted themselves on the back for being so selfless and accommodating. There was no point in arguing. Matt and his family were moving in whether I liked it or not. My comfort didn't matter. That night, I packed up my belongings, clothes, toiletries, my laptop, and stared at the basement suite I'd called home for years. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. My books lined the shelves, cozy blankets covered the couch, and my favorite scented candles made the space feel like me. And now, all of it was being stripped away without so much as a conversation. My parents didn't ask how I felt. They didn't care. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't stay. Not in the hobby room, not in a house where I was nothing more than a supporting character in someone else's story. I booked a 2-week stay at an all-inclusive resort in the Florida Keys, a simple, affordable place that offered exactly what I needed, peace and quiet. It wasn't fancy, but it beat paying $1,600 a month to live in a house where I clearly didn't belong. When I told my parents about my plan, they barely batted an eye. Mom even said, "Well, if that's what you need to do." No remorse. No acknowledgement. But 2 days into my stay, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mom. "Where's the money for rent and groceries this month? We're counting on it to help support Matt and the kids." I stared at the screen, dumbfounded. Surely, she wasn't serious. I called her, and the conversation spiraled out of control. Mom insisted I should still pay because we're family, and Matt needed the space more than I did. When Dad jumped in, his tone was harsher than I'd ever heard. "You can't just abandon us like this. We raised you better than that." Then Matt chimed in, full of entitlement. "Sarah, you don't understand. I have a family to take care of. You don't need the space like we do." I snapped. "Matt, when you had a job, did you ever send money to Mom and Dad to help out?" "No. You spent it all on yourself. So why am I expected to bail you out now?" That shut him up, for a moment. But the damage was done. They painted me as selfish, ungrateful, and abandoning my family. For years, I'd carried the weight of helping my parents and being the responsible one, only to be cast aside when I finally stood up for myself. It was then I realized this wasn't about helping my family, it was about control. They expected me to play a role I never agreed to, and when I refused, they turned on me. Out of guilt, I sent them $400 for groceries. But that was it. I wasn't going to keep funding their lives at the expense of my own. What I didn't realize was that standing up for myself was only the beginning. The backlash would be unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The freedom I tasted during those days at the resort was something I hadn't even realized I was yearning for all these years. But, as I should have expected, it didn't last. By the third day, my phone began buzzing incessantly, texts and missed calls stacking up one after the other. Mom's messages were laced with disappointment, Dad's with quiet indignation, and Matt's with outright guilt-tripping. Each notification felt like a punch, dragging me back into the chaos I'd tried so hard to escape. It was painfully clear that my brother had joined forces with my parents in what felt like a relentless campaign to break me down. At first, I ignored them. I told myself I needed space, and surely, they'd calm down once they realized I wasn't biting. But the messages didn't stop. When the calls began flooding in, I finally gave in out of sheer frustration. What I heard was staggering, accusations of selfishness, pleas that masqueraded as demands, and a sense of entitlement so brazen that it left me speechless. They painted a picture where I was the villain, abandoning my struggling family when they needed me most. Matt's sanctimonious justification stung the worst. This, coming from a man who'd never thought twice about his own reckless choices, was almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. I hung up, knowing there was no reasoning with any of them. As the week dragged on, I realized there was no escaping them. They were physically 1,000 miles away in Riverside, but their words clung to me like a shadow. Every time I checked my phone, there was another message waiting to ambush me. The tone shifted constantly, guilt one moment, anger the next, or an exhausting blend of both. Mom would appeal to my heartstrings. "Think of Tyler and Noah, they're just little boys. Do you really want them to suffer because you're being stubborn?" Dad followed with his usual stoicism turned judgment. "You owe it to us. We raised you, now it's your turn to step up." And Matt? His were laced with venom. "You'll regret this when the boys remember their aunt turned her back on them." It didn't end with just them. Somehow, my extended family got involved. Calls started pouring in from people I hadn't spoken to in years, Aunt Linda, Uncle Gary, and even distant cousins I barely knew. Each one sang the same tune. Aunt Linda's syrupy concern during one call still rings in my ears. "You know how much your parents have done for you, Sarah. Can't you just help a little longer? A little longer. The phrase churned in my head like a broken record. How long was a little longer, exactly? Another month? Another year? Forever? It seemed no one cared that I'd already been carrying far more than my share of the load for years. The breaking point came the day after I returned from the Keys. I was barely done unpacking when there was a knock at the door of my small apartment in Columbus. To my shock, my parents were standing there. Mom looked worn down but resolute, clutching a thick folder in her hands. Dad's usual silent presence loomed behind her like a storm cloud. Without waiting for an invitation, they brushed past me and made themselves comfortable on my couch. Mom spread out papers across the coffee table, utility bills, repair estimates, grocery receipts, all neatly stacked as though this was some corporate negotiation. I stared at the spread, instantly recognizing their strategy. "Look at these expenses," Mom began, her voice teetering between desperation and expectation. The mortgage, the roof repairs, school supplies for Matt's kids, it was all there, a blatant plea for financial rescue. I stood frozen, stunned by their audacity. I no longer lived in that house. Why on earth should I pay for any of this? But Dad, as always, delivered his sharp-edged reasoning. Family sticks together when times are tough. You don't just walk away when things get hard. It wasn't a plea. It was a demand cloaked in guilt. My frustration boiled over. For years, they had made decisions for me, decisions that disregarded my feelings, my space, my autonomy. And now, they expected me to fund those very choices without so much as a conversation. It wasn't just entitlement, it was manipulation disguised as familial duty. When I firmly told them to leave, the shock on their faces was almost satisfying. Mom's tone softened in a last-ditch effort, her words dripping with manufactured sincerity. "Think of Tyler and Noah, they don't understand why their aunt isn't helping." But I had finally seen through the facade. This wasn't about the boys or the bills, it was about control. My refusal to play the part of the obedient, self-sacrificing daughter was threatening their carefully maintained family dynamic. After they left, I locked the door behind them and crumpled onto the couch, shaking with frustration and exhaustion. That night, as I lay awake, I saw my life for what it had become. For years, I'd quietly sacrificed my own financial freedom and peace of mind so my family could live comfortably. And the more I gave, the more they demanded. It was a cycle I had unknowingly fed, and now, breaking free felt like an uphill battle. The next morning, I made a choice. I would still help when I could, but on my terms, not theirs. I wouldn't pay for a house I no longer lived in, nor would I fund Matt's life or his kids' school supplies. And most importantly, I wouldn't feel guilty for protecting my own boundaries. I sent Mom one final text explaining my stance, brief but firm. Her response came within minutes, predictably laced with disappointment. "I can't believe you're doing this to us, Sarah. We're family." I didn't reply. For the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming control of my own life. But my relief was short-lived. Standing up to my family wasn't just a ripple in the water, it was a full-scale tsunami. And, in true Evans family fashion, the next wave was on its way, a virtual family meeting where everyone with a phone and an opinion would get a front-row seat to my crucifixion. It began with an email from Mom. The subject line read, "Family meeting this Sunday at 3 p.m. The body of the email was just as direct, "Your aunts, uncles, and cousins will be joining. Please don't miss it." That please was laced with a passive-aggressive undertone, so sharp it could have cut glass. A whole family meeting, seriously? They were actually gathering the entire extended family to stage an intervention, as if an ambush would somehow fix me. For a moment, I considered ignoring it entirely. Let them yell into the digital void without me, I thought. But I knew better. Skipping it would only feed their narrative. Sarah's avoiding us because she knows she's wrong. So, with a pit in my stomach, I begrudgingly set an alarm for 2:55 p.m. and prepared myself for the inevitable onslaught. When the screen loaded, there they all were, my parents, Matt, Aunt Linda, Uncle Gary, Cousin Rachel, and a smattering of other relatives I only ever saw during holiday dinners or the occasional wedding. Each face bore a tight-lipped, disapproving expression. It was clear I was walking into a firing squad. Mom opened the meeting with her usual dramatic flair. Her voice was coated in an artificial sweetness that masked her true intent. The words spilled out as though she were addressing a child who had strayed from the fold. Her tone dripped with condescension, framing this intervention as an act of love rather than a calculated effort to guilt me back into submission. What followed was an exhausting blur of accusations and guilt-ridden speeches. Aunt Linda leaned heavily on sentimentality. We're all family here, Sarah. You can't just turn your back when people are struggling. Uncle Gary went for practicality. Your parents have done everything for you. Now that it's your turn, you're acting like it's too much to ask. Family comes first. Cousin Rachel chimed in with her unsolicited moral guidance. I understand wanting independence, but cutting off your family isn't the answer. That's not how we were raised. And then there was Matt, who took his performance to a whole new level. Do you know how hard this is for Becky and me? The kids don't understand why their aunt suddenly doesn't care about them. Jason even asked me the other day why you don't want to see them anymore. That last part hit like a sucker punch. I adored my nephews, and Matt knew exactly how to wield that against me. His words weren't just manipulative, they were designed to make me feel like a monster. Finally, after what felt like hours, they paused long enough for me to speak. My hands were trembling as I unmuted myself, but I steadied my breath and began. I love this family, I started, my voice firm but measured. I've been helping for years, paying rent, covering groceries, doing whatever I could to keep things running. But this? This is too much. Mom's expression hardened, but I pressed on. I'm not living in the house anymore. You gave away my space without asking, and now you expect me to keep paying for it? That's not fair. I'm not abandoning anyone, I'm finally taking care of myself for once. The screen fell silent. Mom shook her head slightly, already preparing her rebuttal, but I wasn't finished. Turning to Matt Square, I continued. Matt, you're my brother, and I care about you. But you've never been responsible with money. When you had a job, did you send anything to help Mom and Dad? No. You spent it on yourself. Now that you're in trouble, suddenly I'm the bad guy for not bailing you out? Matt's face flushed, but he stayed quiet. Emboldened, I looked at the rest of them. And the rest of you, where were you when I was keeping everything afloat? Not a word from anyone when I was paying $1,600 a month for a basement suite I barely used. But the second I set a boundary, I'm selfish? The silence was deafening. Aunt Linda looked scandalized, Uncle Gary frowned deeply, and Mom's face teetered on the edge of tears. Dad sat with his arms crossed, avoiding eye contact entirely. Finally, Mom broke the silence with a well-worn line, we just don't understand why you're acting like this. This isn't like you. And that was the final straw. This is me, I said sharply, my voice unwavering. I'm just not the doormat you've gotten used to. Without waiting for a response, I clicked leave meeting and shut my laptop with a satisfying snap. The fallout was immediate. Texts flooded in within minutes. Mom, you didn't have to humiliate us like that. We were just trying to have a conversation. Matt, you've changed. I hope you're happy leaving your family behind. Aunt Linda, I can't believe how disrespectful you were to your parents. I ignored them all. I didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore, not after everything. But even as I justified my actions to myself, a gnawing guilt began to creep in. Years of conditioning whispered that I was the problem, that I was abandoning my family. Growing up, I'd been taught that family always came first, no matter what. Breaking free from that mindset was harder than I'd imagined. I'd always been the responsible one, the dependable daughter who kept her head down and avoided causing trouble. Standing up for myself now felt strange, almost like I was violating some unspoken family code. That night, I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, replaying everything that had unfolded. The deeper I thought about it, the clearer it became. This was never just about money or space. It was about control. For years, my family had leaned on me, assuming I'd always fall in line. The moment I stepped out of that role, they turned on me with a vengeance. I didn't regret speaking up during the family meeting. In fact, it was the most honest I'd been with them in years. But I also knew the battle wasn't over. My family wasn't the type to quietly accept boundaries. They were just getting started. After the meeting, I held out hope, however naive, that things might calm down. Maybe, just maybe, they'd take a step back and reflect. But I was wrong. If anything, my refusal to cave only fueled their determination. It was as if setting boundaries had become a challenge for them, something to dismantle and overcome. The guilt trips grew sharper, the manipulation bolder, and the attempts to pull me back into their fold turned downright invasive. A few days later, I was wrapping up a client report when my coworker, Sam, poked his head into my office. "Hey, Sarah," he said casually, "some woman called reception asking for you. Said she was your mom. She left a message with Emily, but I think you should hear it." My stomach dropped. I followed him to reception, where Emily handed me a sticky note with a slightly puzzled expression. The note read, "This is Nancy Evans, Sarah's mother. We're going through a tough time, and I need to discuss some urgent family matters that might be affecting her focus at work. Please encourage her to step up. Thank you." I stared at the note, my face burning with humiliation. My mom had called my workplace, not because of an emergency, but to suggest I wasn't pulling my weight for the family. It was a low blow, even for her. Sam gave me an awkward smile. "Everything okay?" he asked tentatively. "Yeah, it's fine," I muttered, forcing a tight smile. "Just family stuff." But it wasn't fine. That evening, I called her the second I got home. Why would she do this? Why would she drag my professional life into her crusade? Her response was indignant, as though I was the unreasonable one. She justified her actions as a necessary step to get my attention. She genuinely believed that involving my workplace might make me see how serious this is. By the time the call ended, I realized arguing with her was pointless. She was so entrenched in her narrative that no amount of reasoning could penetrate. I hung up, shaking with anger. But her interference wasn't over. The next morning, I woke to a flood of notifications. I didn't even need to check my phone to know who it was. Sure enough, Matt had taken to Facebook. His post was just vague enough to stoke sympathy without giving away details. In tough times, you find out who your real family is. Some people forget where they came from when it's inconvenient for them. We're doing the best we can, but it's hard when others won't step up. The comments rolled in like clockwork. "Stay strong, Matt. You've got this. Family is everything. Whoever's letting you down will regret it one day." It was textbook Matt, playing the victim, rallying support, and casting me as the villain. The kicker was a private message from him. "Jason keeps asking why you don't visit anymore. Do you want me to tell him the truth, that his aunt doesn't care about him?" I stared at the message, my heart breaking and my anger flaring simultaneously. I hated how he weaponized his kids against me, knowing how much I loved them. But I refused to respond. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of playing his game. Then, on Saturday morning, they escalated again. I was sipping coffee, savoring a rare moment of quiet, when a knock at the door shattered the peace. My heart sank as I peered through the peephole. There they were, Mom and Dad, standing on my doorstep, a manila folder in Mom's hand. I debated not answering, pretending I wasn't home. But I knew they wouldn't leave. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. Mom wasted no time pushing past me into the living room, Dad trailing behind. They settled on my couch like they owned the place, and Mom spread out a collection of bills and receipts across the coffee table. "We need to talk about finances," she began, her tone resolute. I rubbed my temples, already exhausted. Mom, we've been through this. I'm not paying for a house I don't live in anymore. You don't understand, Dad said, his voice tight. We're struggling. Matt's struggling. The roof needs to be fixed before winter, and there are school fees for Jason and Noah. It's not just about you. That was the breaking point. It's always about me. I snapped. About what I can give, what I can pay for, and what sacrifices I can make to keep everyone else comfortable. Well, I'm done. I'm not your ATM, and I'm not responsible for Matt's problems. Mom's voice cracked as she countered, We're not asking for much, Sarah. Just $2,000 a month to help with the basics. Is that really so unreasonable? I stared at her, stunned. $2,000 a month? Are you even hearing yourself? The conversation spiraled into another round of guilt, blame, and emotional manipulation. Every justification I offered was met with the same retorts, after everything we've done for you. Family helps each other. Mark has kids to think about. You wouldn't understand because you're single. Eventually, I'd had enough. I stood up and pointed toward the door. You need to leave. Mom looked at me like I'd struck her. Sarah, she began, but Dad muttered something under his breath, and they gathered their things. The door slammed behind them, leaving me in stunned silence. I sank onto the couch, feeling like I'd just run a marathon. My head pounded, and my chest felt tight as I replayed the argument over and over. Mom's tears. Dad's disappointment. Their unrelenting pressure. But underneath the guilt, a quiet resolve began to take root. I wasn't failing them. I was just done being the sacrificial lamb. Done sacrificing my own well-being for their comfort. That realization came with a heavy weight, but it also came with clarity. That night, I lay in bed and made myself a promise. I wouldn't let them drag me back into their cycle, no matter how hard they pushed. This time, I would stand my ground. No matter how many guilt trips they threw my way, I resolved to hold firm. I owed it to myself to stop being their crutch. But, as I was about to learn, they weren't done, not by a long shot. After my parents' surprise visit and their absurd demand for $2,000 a month, I thought I'd seen the worst of their tactics. I told myself that standing my ground would make them back off, but I underestimated them. People who thrive on control rarely accept boundaries, they escalate. The following week was like living under siege. My parents wasted no time spreading their narrative, ensuring every relative within reach heard their version of events. I didn't realize how far it had gone until the calls and texts started pouring in from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Uncle Gary, always the self-proclaimed family mediator, was the first to reach out. His message was dripping with faux concern. Mom had called him in tears, heartbroken over my betrayal. He urged me to compromise, framing it as an issue of pride. I clenched my jaw reading his words. Was it pride to refuse to fund someone else's mortgage while I barely had room to breathe? Then came Rachel, my cousin, who couldn't resist inserting herself into drama. Her text was curt and judgmental, accusing me of letting my brother and his kids suffer. The irony of being labeled heartless wasn't lost on me. These were the same people who had stood by silently while I'd shouldered the burden for years. Meanwhile, Mark was in full performance mode. His social media posts became more frequent and pointed. He painted himself as the struggling hero, valiantly trying to provide for his family while being abandoned by his selfish sister. Comments poured in from his friends and acquaintances, showering him with sympathy. It was humiliating, especially when Rachel screenshot one of his posts and shared it in our cousin's group chat with a not-so-subtle jab. Mark knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't care about the truth, he cared about the narrative. But my mother wasn't content to leave the guilt-tripping to texts and whispers. She crossed another line, one I never saw coming. On Tuesday morning, I was in the middle of a conference call when my boss, Tom, knocked on my office door. His expression was uncomfortable as he asked to speak with me privately. I muted the call, already feeling a sense of dread. Tom explained that my mom had called the office again, leaving a message at reception about urgent family matters. My face flushed with embarrassment. Work had been the one place I'd kept separate from my family's chaos, and now she was dragging it into the mess. Tom tried to be understanding, but the damage was done. I sat at my desk afterward, staring blankly at my screen, humiliation and anger bubbling inside me. By the end of the week, I was emotionally drained. The constant calls, texts, and unsolicited advice from relatives left me feeling like I was drowning. My parents pushed harder, Mark weaponized his children, and the rest of the family took sides, with most of them against me. Every day felt like another battle in a war I never wanted to fight. And then, as if the emotional onslaught wasn't enough, Mark decided to escalate further with an unannounced visit. It was Saturday afternoon, and I'd just finished cleaning my apartment when I heard a knock at the door. I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. Mark stood there, arms crossed, his face etched with anger. He demanded a conversation, insisting that I couldn't just walk away from my family. He guilted me about Jason and Liam, twisting their innocence into a weapon to cut at my resolve. But something inside me snapped. I told him the truth, that I wasn't the one who walked away. That he had made it my responsibility to fix his mess, and that I was done. For once, Mark had no comeback. I quietly told him to leave and closed the door. As I stood there, shaking from the confrontation, I realized how exhausted I was. The constant pressure, the relentless manipulation, the endless blame, it was suffocating. That night, sitting on my couch, I replayed everything from the past few months. The eviction from my basement suite, the barrage of guilt trips, the lies Mark spread online, and my mom's blatant overreach into my professional life. It wasn't just about money or support, it was about entitlement. My family believed they were owed access to my life, my resources, and my peace, and they were determined to punish me for daring to say no. I knew then that I had to make a choice. I could keep fighting this losing battle, or I could walk away. The next morning, I called Jessica, one of the few people who'd supported me through this. I told her I was leaving, moving out of state, somewhere far enough to start fresh, but close enough to feel like I wasn't running away. Within 2 weeks, I put my plan into motion. I applied for a transfer within my company and started searching for apartments in Charlotte, North Carolina, a city I'd always been curious about. It felt like the right balance, a fresh start without completely cutting ties. On the day I packed up my car and left Columbus, I didn't tell my parents or Mark. I left a simple note at the house. I love you, but I can't keep living this way. I hope you'll understand someday. Driving down the highway toward Charlotte, a mix of emotions churned in my chest. I grieved for the family I'd felt forced to leave behind. I burned with anger over the way they had treated me. But above all, I felt relief that for the first time in years, I was prioritizing myself. The guilt still lingered, but as the miles stretched out behind me, I realized this wasn't an act of running away. It was an act of choosing myself. And for once, that was enough.